The document hit the desk with a sound like a gunshot. Ella Walker did not flinch. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 years, and she had promised herself she would not flinch when it came. She pressed her palms flat against the worn oak surface of her desk, looked up at Chester Sheridan standing in her doorway, and felt the full weight of everything they had never said to each other crash down between them like a collapsed mine shaft. "Sign it," Chester said. His voice was low, controlled, and she could hear every fractured thing underneath that control. He was tall in her doorway, filling it the way he filled every room he entered, broad-shouldered and weather-darkened, with that particular stillness about him that she had once mistaken for peace and now recognized as something much more dangerous. "Ella, sign the document." She looked down at the paper. Arizona Territory, 1883. The water rights agreement between the Sheridan Ranch and the Walker homestead, transferring full access to the Cottonwood Creek tributary to Chester Sheridan in exchange for $1 and other considerations. She had read it 3 times before he arrived. She knew every word. She knew exactly what it would mean for her family's land if she signed it, and she knew exactly what it would mean if she did not. "You rode all the way out here at 7 in the morning," she said quietly. "You could not send your foreman. I needed to see you sign it myself." There it was, the betrayal she had been expecting, wrapped in the particular pain of Chester Sheridan saying something true. He had come himself. He had ridden 4 hours before dawn through the high desert because he needed to see her face when she surrendered the last thing her father had left her. And somehow that honesty made it worse than any lie could have. Ella reached into her desk drawer. Chester moved forward half a step, a reflex, as though he thought she might produce a weapon. She almost smiled at that. She pulled out her pen, the good one with the silver nib that had belonged to her father, and she set it beside the document. "Sit down, Chester," she said. "I don't need to sit down." "You will," she told him, "because I am going to sign this agreement. And then I am going to show you what I've written at the bottom, and after you read it, you are going to want to be sitting." Something shifted in his expression. She watched it happen, watched the certainty he had ridden in with begin to develop cracks. Chester Sheridan was not a man who was often surprised. That was the thing about him that she had noticed first, long before she had noticed his eyes or his hands or the careful, almost tender way he had of listening when she spoke about her father's land. Nothing surprised him. He had built his entire life around being the man who was always ready for whatever came next. She was about to surprise him. She uncapped her pen, smoothed the document, and signed her name in her clearest hand. Ella Walker. And then she drew a neat line beneath her signature and wrote 11 words that she had composed in her head over the course of 3 sleepless nights. She capped the pen. She turned the document to face him and slid it across the desk. Chester sat down. He read the 11 words twice. She watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle in his cheek work, watched something that might have been panic move through those steady gray eyes for the very first time. The condition read, "This agreement is valid only if Chester Sheridan marries Ella Walker within 30 days. The silence in that little adobe office lasted a long time. Outside, a rooster was crowing somewhere on the Walker property, and the morning light was coming gold and sharp through the single east-facing window, and the Arizona desert was waking up around them with complete indifference to what was happening between these 2 people who had circled each other for 3 years without ever finding the courage to close the distance. To understand how they had arrived at this particular morning, you had to go back to the summer of 1880, which was the year Ella Walker first came to the Copper Creek Valley with her father, James Walker, and a wagon loaded with everything the family owned. James Walker had been a stubborn, visionary, tender-hearted man who had read about the Arizona Territory in a pamphlet printed in St. Louis, and had convinced himself that the land described therein was exactly what his family needed. He had sold his failing grain operation in Missouri, purchased 240 acres of deed-registered homestead land in the valley, and brought his daughter west with the absolute confidence of a man who had never let inconvenient facts interfere with a compelling idea. The land was beautiful. It was also brutal, dry as old paper from June through September, crossed by exactly one reliable water source, which was Cottonwood Creek, a cold, fast-running tributary that cut diagonally through the valley and happened to originate on land that already belonged to Chester Sheridan. Chester had been ranching the Copper Creek Valley for 6 years before the Walkers arrived. He had come west from Georgia at 22 with a small inheritance, a working knowledge of cattle, and the kind of quiet, disciplined determination that built things slowly and made them last. By 1880, he was 28 years old, owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, employed 11 men, and had a reputation for being fair, hard, and entirely impossible to read. He met Ella Walker on the second day after the Walkers arrived, when she rode out to the creek with a surveying rod and a handmade map of the property lines, trying to establish exactly where her father's water access began. She was 22 years old, with dark hair and very direct brown eyes, and a way of looking at a problem that reminded Chester immediately of a surgeon he had known once, precise and unsentimental. She had looked at him across the creek with perfect composure and said, "You are standing on my side of the line, Mr. Sheridan." He had stepped back. He had never quite found his way back to comfortable footing around her after that. Their relationship over the following 3 years was one of those arrangements that the Wild West produced with some regularity, born of proximity, mutual necessity, and the deep inconvenience of genuine feeling. They were neighbors. They attended the same church in the town of Copper Creek, a small settlement 4 miles from the valley with a general store, a land office, a hotel, a church, a doctor's office, and the kind of saloon that was technically a billiard hall. They dealt with the same weather, the same supply routes, the same seasonal rhythms of drought and flood and cattle drive. They were not friends, exactly. They were something more complicated than that, and neither of them had ever been willing to name it. Chester helped when Ella's father's wagon broke a wheel 2 miles from town in a summer rainstorm. Ella brought supper to Chester's bunkhouse the winter 2 of his men were laid up with fever, and he was running the whole operation with a skeleton crew. Chester bought her father's excess hay at better than market price when the Walkers had a good cutting year and needed the cash. Ella wrote letters on James Walker's behalf to the Territorial Land Office in Tucson, navigating the bureaucratic requirements that her father found maddening, and twice those letters had cited precedents that also protected Chester's deed against a competing claim from a mining consortium out of Flagstaff. They knew each other's business the way neighbors always did in isolated country. They helped each other the way people did when survival required it. And underneath all of that, moving like that cold creek water through the summer heat, there was something that neither of them spoke about and both of them thought about rather more than was strictly sensible. Then James Walker got sick. The diagnosis came in the fall of 1882 from Dr. Ambrose Holt in Copper Creek, who had trained at a medical college in Philadelphia and was one of the more genuinely capable physicians Ella had encountered in her limited experience of physicians. He called it consumption, which was the word they used in 1882 for what the disease did to a man's lungs, and he told Ella with careful gentleness that her father had perhaps a year, more likely 6 months, and that the dry Arizona air was actually better for him than Missouri would have been, which was a small mercy. Ella received this information on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She rode home from town in the long violet desert dusk and made her father his supper, and sat with him on the porch while the stars appeared one by one in the enormous sky, and she did not tell him how long Dr. Holt thought he had, and she let him talk about what the spring planting would look like, and she listened to every word. After he went asleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table and worked through the mathematics of her situation with the same unsentimental precision she brought to everything. 240 acres, 1 woman alone. The hired hand they had employed through the summer, a young man named Rafael Gutierrez, had left to work his family's land further south and would not be back until spring. The winter was coming. The mortgage payment on the land was due in March. The cattle were healthy but small in number, enough to sustain the property but not enough to generate the kind of income that could cover the debt and the medical bills and the cost of running the place through a difficult season. It was manageable, barely. With careful decisions and no disasters. Then the Prescott Water Authority sent the letter. The Prescott Water Authority was a newly established entity in 1882, backed by railroad money and the territorial government, with a mandate to regulate water usage throughout the central Arizona Territory. Their letter arrived at the Walker homestead in January of 1883, formal and polite and devastating in its implications. It informed James Walker that under the new territorial water regulations, water rights along Cottonwood Creek would require formal documentation and registration by the 1st of April, 1883. Any homestead unable to demonstrate documented water access agreements with upstream property holders would be subject to water usage restrictions that could, at the authority's discretion, limit their access to the creek. Ella read the letter 4 times. Then she walked to the window and looked out at her father's land in the winter light, at the dry brown grass and the dark line of cottonwood trees that marked the creek, and she understood what the letter meant. It meant that the water she had always had access to was now something she needed permission for. It meant that Chester Sheridan, whose land the creek crossed before it reached hers, could be made by the water authority's regulations to either grant her documented rights or deny them. It meant that the most powerful piece of leverage in the valley had just been handed by bureaucratic decree to her neighbor. She did not think Chester would use it against her. That was not, she believed, who he was, but she was also not naive. She knew that ranching was a business, and she knew that Chester was a businessman, and she knew that documented water rights were valuable, and she knew that there were people in the territory who would pay him well to control access to Cottonwood Creek. She was right about all of it. She just did not know about those people yet. Their names were Harlow and Theodore Burke, brothers from Flagstaff with railroad connections, and a pattern of acquiring homestead land throughout the territory in ways that were technically legal and deeply predatory. They had been watching the Copper Creek Valley for 2 years. They had sent a representative to Chester's ranch in October, before the Water Authority letter arrived at the Walker homestead, with a proposal that Chester had declined without much deliberation. The proposal involved him selling his water rights documentation to a holding company that would then use those rights to pressure smaller homesteaders off their land. Chester had declined because he was not that kind of man. But the Burke brothers were patient, and they came back in January with a different proposal, this one with a number attached that was large enough to change the shape of most men's futures, and with a much more specific timeline that coincided precisely with the Water Authority's April deadline. Chester said he would think about it. He should not have said that. Saying he would think about it was the kind of thing that happened when a man was conflicted. And he was conflicted because the number the Burke brothers offered was genuinely significant, large enough to expand his operation in ways he had been planning for years. And because there was a part of him that was very tired and that thought, sometimes, about what it would feel like to not be responsible for 11 men's livelihoods and 2,000 acres of difficult land. He did not tell Ella about the Burke brothers' offer. He told himself this was because it would worry her unnecessarily, since he had no intention of accepting. He was not entirely honest with himself about that reasoning. What happened next was that Ella discovered the Burke brothers herself. She discovered them because she had ridden to Copper Creek in late February to file some paperwork at the land office. And while she was waiting for the land agent, a thin, bespectacled man named Orville Gibbs, to finish with another customer, she heard that customer's conversation through the thin partition wall that divided the waiting area from the main office. The customer was discussing water rights along Cottonwood Creek with the absolute confidence of a man who already believed he owned them. He mentioned the Walker homestead specifically. He mentioned an April transaction. Ella sat very still in her chair and listened to every word. She rode home at a pace that frightened her horse. She went straight to her desk and took out her father's copy of the original homestead deed and read every word of it. The parts about water access, about property lines, about the specific language used in 1878 when the deed was registered. Then she went to her father's bookshelves and found the thin volume on territorial land law that her father had purchased from a catalog in Missouri, and she read that too. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. James Walker had been asleep for hours. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the desert night outside was absolute and cold and full of stars. And Ella Walker sat at her kitchen table and understood that the game she needed to play was not the game she had thought she was playing. The Water Authority regulations gave Chester Sheridan the power to grant or deny her documented water rights. But there was a clause in the original homestead deed, buried in language that most people would have found impenetrable, that specified the Walker property's right to natural water flow as historically established. That clause had not been tested in territorial court, and testing it would take time and money she did not have, and it might not succeed. But the clause existed, and that meant she had something. It was not a winning hand, but it was a card. She spent 3 days thinking about the condition. It came to her not all at once but in pieces, the way solutions sometimes did, assembling itself from small observations. She thought about what Chester Sheridan needed from her, which was a clean legal transfer with no challenges. She thought about what she needed from him, which was water rights and the security of her father's land. She thought about what they had been to each other for 3 years, that complex, unresolved thing that neither of them had ever named. She thought about the way he had looked at her last October at the Harvest Festival in town, when she had been talking with the new schoolteacher and Chester had been standing across the room with his hat in his hands, and she had glanced over and caught him watching her with an expression that he had immediately rearranged into something more neutral but not quite quickly enough. She thought about the Burke brothers and what they represented, and what it would mean for her father's land and for every small homestead in the valley if someone like Chester let men like that into the valley's water supply. And she thought about what marriage would mean, what it had always meant to her, the word, the idea. Her parents had been married for 24 years before her mother died. She had grown up watching a partnership between two people who genuinely liked each other, who made each other laugh, who disagreed about practical matters, and resolved those disagreements through argument and concession and a kind of sturdy mutual respect that looked, from the outside, like ordinary life, but that Ella had come to understand was actually one of the rarer things in the world. She was 25 years old. She had not been looking for marriage. She had been looking for survival. But survival and desire were not as different as people sometimes pretended. She wrote the condition. She read it back to herself. She slept on it for one night and woke up knowing it was right. Then she sent word to Chester Sheridan that she was prepared to discuss the water rights agreement and would like him to bring the document to her property at his earliest convenience. He arrived the next morning, 7 o'clock, the document in his hand, riding his big gray gelding at a pace that suggested he had been awake most of the night. She had watched him come across the flat from her kitchen window, had seen the set of his shoulders, the way he rode when he was forcing himself to do something he was not at peace with. She had made coffee. She had set out 2 cups. She had opened the desk, placed the good pen beside it, and waited. Now he sat in the chair across from her, the document between them, and he was reading her 11-word condition for the second time, and the rooster was still crowing outside, and the morning was still coming gold through the window, and Ella Walker was the calmest she had been in months. Chester set the document down. He looked at her. "You cannot be serious," he said. "I am completely serious. This is not a legally enforceable condition, Ella. You are welcome to take that position with a judge, she said. But before you do, you should know that I have also filed a preliminary challenge with the Territorial Land Office, citing the 1878 deed clause regarding established water flow. That challenge will delay your water authority documentation by at least 90 days, which puts you past the April deadline. She paused. I spoke with Orville Gibbs yesterday afternoon. Chester was very still. You went to the land office. I did. When? 3 days ago. He absorbed this. She watched him recalculate. He was fast. She had always known that underneath the stillness he was exceptionally fast, and she could almost see him moving the pieces, understanding what she had done and why and exactly how well positioned she was. You heard something, he said. In town, you heard about an offer. I heard enough. A long silence. Outside, a wind had come up, pushing through the cottonwoods along the creek, and she could hear the leaves moving, that dry, papery sound that was one of the specific sounds of this place she had come to love. The Burke brothers, Chester said finally. It was not a question. I did not hear names, Ella said. But yes, probably the Burke brothers. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at her father's land. She let him stand there. She poured coffee into both cups and waited. You know, I had not decided to take their offer, he said to the window. I know that is what you would like me to believe. He turned around. There was something in his expression that was not anger, though it had some of anger's heat. It was closer to frustration, the particular kind that comes from being understood more completely than you had expected. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Ella? He said. Beyond making my morning considerably more complicated than I planned. I am trying to keep my father's land, she said simply, and I am trying to do it in a way that closes the door on the Burke brothers permanently. And I am trying to do it in a way that is honest. There is nothing honest about a forced marriage proposal. I did not force anything. I presented a condition. You can refuse it. The document is not signed under duress. You can walk out that door and take your unsigned agreement, and I will file my challenge, and we will spend the next year in territorial court, and the Burke brothers will find some other angle. She held his gaze. Or you can consider what I am actually offering and make a decision like the intelligent man I know you are. Something shifted. She could feel it before she saw it, some realignment of the space between them. What are you actually offering? Chester said. His voice had changed. The controlled politeness was gone. She was hearing something underneath it now, raw and unguarded, and the sound of it made her heart move in her chest in a way she had been expecting and still was not quite prepared for. I am offering a partnership, she said carefully. This land and your land. The water rights combined and documented properly, which no one can then challenge because there is no separation between the properties. A legal entity that the Burke brothers cannot split apart. She paused. And I am offering you a marriage with a woman who will be honest with you and work beside you, and who will not pretend that this is only a business arrangement. The silence after that was different from all the previous silences. It was heavier. It had more in it. Chester came back to the desk. He did not sit down. He stood and looked at the document, at her 11 words for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and she made herself hold his gaze, and what she saw there was something she had been half afraid of seeing and half desperate to see. The same thing she had seen in October at the Harvest Festival, and many times before that in smaller doses. The thing that looked like a man who had been guarding a particular feeling for a very long time, suddenly standing in a room where the guards were no longer holding. Your father, Chester said. He is ill, yes. You have not told him how ill. I have told him what I thought was helpful to tell him. Chester looked at her for another long moment. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at the document and then at her, and she thought she saw something that might have been wonder move through his expression. I have thought about this, he said slowly. About you, about what this would look like. He stopped, started again. I want you to understand that I was not going to take the Burke brothers' offer. I need you to know that. All right, she said. And I want you to know that if I agree to this condition, I am not agreeing to it as a business arrangement." Her breath came a little faster. She controlled it. "What are you agreeing to it as?" Chester Sheridan, who had been ranching in the desert for 11 years and who had rebuilt himself from almost nothing and who was the least expressive person she had ever known, looked at her across the desk with every guard completely down and said, "The honest answer. I am agreeing to it as the most terrified I have ever been in my life, because I wanted this for a long time and I did not know how to come to it without being pushed. And you pushed me." Ella Walker, who had planned this moment with extraordinary care and who had believed she was prepared for any response, felt tears sting the backs of her eyes and blinked them away fast. "Then we are in agreement," she said. "We are in agreement," Chester said. He picked up the pen. He signed his name beneath hers in a hand that was steady and clear, Chester Sheridan. And then he looked up, and for the first time in 3 years of knowing each other, he smiled at her without reservation, without the careful management she was accustomed to, just fully and openly. And it was such a different thing from his usual expression that she felt it like warmth from a fire. "You had better tell me what this courtship is going to look like," he said, "given that we apparently have 30 days. The courtship, such as it was, became one of the more talked-about events in the Copper Creek Valley in the spring of 1883. Chester came to the Walker homestead the following morning, a Sunday, and asked to speak with James Walker on the porch. Ella watched from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, her heart working harder than usual. She watched her father listen to Chester speak, watched the old man's face move through several expressions, and then watched James Walker throw his head back and laugh with a fullness that the consumption had been stealing from him for months. She went outside. Her father looked at her with eyes that were bright with something that might have been relief, and he said, "I always thought you two were going to get there eventually. I just thought it might take another 5 years." "James," Chester said, which was the first time Ella had ever heard him use her father's given name, "I want you to know that I am going to take care of this land, the way you would." Her father looked at him for a long moment with the assessment of a man who had spent decades sizing people up. Then he nodded once slowly, with the finality of a man who had made a decision he was at peace with. "I know you will," he said. "That is why I am not going to fuss." The water rights agreement was filed with the land office that week, Chester's attorney alongside Orville Gibbs, the condition documented and witnessed. The challenge Ella had filed was simultaneously withdrawn. The combined property, Walker Homestead and Sheridan Ranch united under a joint deed of management, created a water rights entity so cleanly established that, when the Prescott Water Authority representative arrived in Copper Creek in late March to process documentation, he took one look at the filing and told his supervisor it was the most airtight claim he had seen in the territory. The Burke brothers sent a letter. Chester read it at his kitchen table one evening when Ella was there helping him work through the combined property inventory. He read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the stove. It caught and burned with a brief brightness, and neither of them mentioned it again. Ella came to know Chester's ranch, the parts of it she had only observed from a distance, in those 30 days in a way that surprised her with its intimacy. The way the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The shelf of books beside the fireplace, mostly practical texts on land management and animal husbandry, but also, unexpectedly, 3 volumes of poetry that she did not ask about immediately, and that he did not volunteer an explanation for, which made her like him more. The particular relationship he had with his men, all 11 of them, which was nothing like what she expected from a man of his reputation for self-containment. He knew their family situations, their concerns, the names of their children. She watched him mediating a dispute between 2 of them one afternoon with a patience and a fairness that settled something for her about who he was. He came to know her land in the same way, the part she had built herself since arriving in 1880. The kitchen garden that she had coaxed out of the desert soil, with a stubbornness that her father called inspiring and her neighbors called slightly alarming. The system of small irrigation channels she had designed and dug herself that routed creek water to the garden and the small cattle yard. A genuinely clever piece of engineering that Chester spent a long time studying one afternoon and then looked at her with an expression that she filed away carefully. "Who designed this?" he asked. "I did." "When?" "The first summer. I had to figure out the water problem before the heat came." He looked at the channels again. "This is better than what I have at the main house." "I know," she said. "I saw yours." He looked at her. "You came and looked at my irrigation system." "I needed to understand what I was working with," she said. Neighborly assessment. His mouth curved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "How long ago was this?" She considered being evasive and decided against it. "The summer of 1881. "That is 2 years ago." "Yes. You have been thinking about this for 2 years." "I have been thinking about the water problem for 2 years," she said carefully. "The other things I have been thinking about are a separate matter." He stepped closer. They were standing beside the largest of her irrigation channels in the afternoon light, with the cottonwoods making their dry sound in the wind and the smell of spring desert all around them, sage and dry grass and the faint coolness from the water running below them. "What other things?" Chester said. She looked up at him. He was very close. This was something she had noticed over the past week, that the careful distance he had always maintained between them, that particular social acreage that characterized his manner with everyone, had been quietly reducing itself. He was not a man who touched casually. He was not a man who leaned in. But he had been leaning in by degrees in the way people do when something that has been held back is being permitted forward. "You know what other things?" she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and so careful that she felt it all the way down her spine. "I want to hear you say it," he said quietly. "That is very demanding of you. I think I have earned a small demand." She laughed, which was not the response she had planned, but it was genuine and it surprised both of them. Chester's expression opened up at the sound of it, that same unguarded warmth she had seen on the morning she showed him the condition, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this man's smile was one of the more dangerous things in the territory. "I have been thinking about you," she said. "If you need the specific words." "I have been thinking about you for a long time, and I had a plan, and the plan required me to be patient, and patience has never been my most developed quality, so it cost me something." "What kind of plan?" "One that involved you eventually arriving at the correct conclusions on your own, without me having to put a condition in a legal document." He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry I made you do it that way." "Do not apologize. You were frightened. That is human." "I was not frightened," he said with almost convincing firmness. "Chester, you just told me 2 days ago that agreeing to my condition was the most terrified you had ever been." He looked pained. "That was a moment of unusual candor. I am going to need you to continue having those." Another long look. The afternoon was very still. The creek moved over its stones somewhere behind the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, one of his men was calling out to one of the cattle, and the whole wide Arizona sky was going from blue to gold above them. "All right," Chester said. "Here is candor. I thought about telling you about the Burke brothers offer the week it came. I thought about it and I decided not to, and I told myself it was because I was not going to take it anyway, but the truth is I was ashamed. I did not want you to know I had considered it even for a moment." "Considered and refused," she said. "I still considered it." "That is enough to be ashamed of when the land in question belongs to a woman whose father is dying." She was quiet for a moment. "You did not know he was dying when the offer came." "I knew he was sick." "Chester." She turned to face him fully. "You are the most scrupulous person I know. The fact that you refused an offer that most men would have taken without a moment's hesitation, and that you then sat with shame about the moment of consideration, tells me exactly what kind of man you are. I do not need you to be perfect. I need you to be the man you actually are." He looked at her for a long time. "You are very direct." "I know." "I find it extraordinary," he said. which was not what she expected him to say and which she thought about for the rest of that afternoon and well into the evening. They were married on the 7th of April, 1883, in the Copper Creek Church, a small white building that was also used for town meetings and, on one memorable occasion, as a holding space for a particularly large cattle delivery that had arrived during an unseasonable snowstorm. Reverend Miles Cowbell, who had been performing weddings in the valley for 12 years, said afterward that he had seldom married two people who looked at each other with such absolute and unsurprised certainty, as though they were completing a formality about something they had already privately settled. James Walker attended in his Sunday clothes, thinner than he had been but straight-backed and present, and he stood beside his daughter at the altar with one of her hands in his and the expression of a man who has been granted something he did not ask for and is trying to be dignified about the gratitude. Chester's foreman, a big, quiet Texan named Samuel Beaumont who had been with him for 4 years, served as witness. He shook Chester's hand afterward with a grip that communicated a great deal and said, "About time," which was the most words he had strung together in public in recent memory. The reception was a dinner at the Copper Creek Hotel, 12 people including the Walkers and Chester's course staff, and it was characterized by the kind of warmth that comes when people who genuinely like each other are relieved that something has worked out the way it should. Rafael Gutierrez, Ella's former hired hand who had returned to the valley in March, brought a guitar and played Spanish wedding music until the hotelier politely suggested that the late hour might mean the guests should allow the happy couple to retire. Chester and Ella rode back to the ranch house together in the April dark, the stars enormous above them and the desert air cool and smelling of night-blooming flowers, and they were quiet for most of the ride, the comfortable kind of quiet that comes between people who do not need to fill all the space with sound. At the gate Chester dismounted and came to help her down, and she put her hands on his shoulders and let him lift her, and then he did not immediately put her down but held her for a moment with her feet just above the ground, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the solidity that was the most physical expression of who he was. "This is the part I did not plan past," she admitted. "You plan past everything," he said. "I planned to the wedding. After that I thought we would figure it out as we went. That is either very wise or a significant oversight, probably both." He set her down. He kept one hand at her waist and the other came up to her face, the same gesture as beside the irrigation channel but held longer this time, and she leaned into it before she could think about whether that was the composed response. "Ella," he said, "I want to tell you something. Tell me. This is not a business arrangement for me. I need you to know that. What I said that morning in your office, I meant every word of it. I know you did. I want you to be happy here. I want this to be a good life for you." She pressed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "Chester, I negotiated a water rights agreement with a marriage condition. I am already exactly where I wanted to be. I am fine." He laughed. It was a full laugh, unguarded the way his smiles were becoming, and it was a beautiful sound in the April dark, and she stored it carefully in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. He kissed her then, and she kissed him back, and the night went very still around them in the way that nights do sometimes when something that has been waiting a long time finally arrives. James Walker died in June. He went the way Dr. Holt had predicted, gently, his breath getting shorter over several weeks until one morning it simply stopped. Ella was with him. She held his hand and talked to him about the spring garden and about the creek, and about how the young cottonwood he had planted the first summer was going to be a proper tree in another 5 years, and he smiled at the right places, or she thought he did, and then he was quiet and still, and the morning went on around them. Chester came the moment she sent word. He arrived before noon, dusty from hard riding, and he came straight to the bedroom where she was still sitting beside her father's bed, and he did not say anything but sat down on the other side of the bed and took her free hand in both of his, and they sat like that for a while, the two of them and the room and the silence. The grief was real and it was enormous, and she did not try to manage it into a smaller shape. She had always known it was coming. She had prepared for it with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. And she had been right that preparation helped to a degree. It helped with the practical things, the arrangements, the paperwork, the letter writing, the notification of the few remaining Missouri relations. It did not help with the particular emptiness of walking into the kitchen in the morning and not hearing her father's voice or his cough or the sound of him moving around the house. Chester understood that some of the grieving needed to happen without him trying to solve it. This surprised her, how clearly he understood that. He was there when she needed him, and he gave her space when she needed that. And when she woke in the night disoriented with grief, he was present and warm beside her. And she thought that she had perhaps underestimated the emotional intelligence of a man who she had always assumed was more comfortable with cattle than with people. She said this to him one evening, about 2 weeks after her father's death, when they were sitting on the ranch house porch watching the sunset paint the desert in colors that did not seem like they should be possible. "I underestimated you," she said. Chester looked at her sideways. "In what respect?" "I thought you were good at managing things. I thought you were competent and fair and honest. I did not think you were particularly good at the softer things. And now I think you have been paying more attention than anyone realized." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother was ill for 3 years before she died," he said. "I was 14 when it started and 17 when it finished. My father was not well equipped for it. I was the one who learned what she needed." He paused. "I learned that presence matters more than words most of the time. And that the practical things, the meals and the arrangements, those are a form of love even when they do not look like it." She turned to look at him. He was watching the sunset with his usual stillness, but she could hear the cost of what he had just said, the way he kept old things carefully below the surface and had just permitted this one to come up. "I did not know that about your mother," she said. "I do not talk about it much. Thank you for telling me." He looked at her, a brief direct look that carried everything. "You are my wife," he said. "These are the things wives should know. And husbands," she said, "I want you to know them too." "Tell me something I do not know about you." She thought for a moment. "I wanted to be a lawyer," she said, "when I was young, before we came west. My father encouraged it and my mother thought it was impractical, and we had great long arguments about it at the dinner table that I loved." She smiled. "I read everything I could find about land law because it was the closest thing available to what I actually wanted to study." "The 1878 deed clause," Chester said. "I had it memorized for 2 years," she said, "just in case." He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was the one she had started to think of as the real one, the unguarded one that meant he had stopped managing his face around her. "Ella, you are the most remarkable person I know." "I am a pragmatist with legal tendencies," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I mean." The summer of 1883 was a working summer. They folded the Walker homestead into the operations of the Sheridan ranch, with a thoroughness that required both of them at full capacity. The combined water rights, documented and registered before the April deadline, were now the most solid water claim in the valley, and 3 neighboring homesteaders had come to Chester asking if they could establish tributary agreements that used the Walker-Sheridan documentation as an anchor. Chester had said yes to 2 of them and consulted Ella about the third, a complicated situation involving a disputed property line, and they had worked through it together at the kitchen table over 2 evenings and come out the other side with a solution that the third homesteader called the fairest thing he had encountered in 20 years of frontier living. This became a pattern. Not by design, exactly, but by the natural expression of who they each were. Ella's knowledge of land law and water regulation, combined with Chester's understanding of the practical mechanics of the territory, made them a resource that their community found valuable. People came to them with problems. Some of those problems were directly related to the water rights situation that continued to evolve as the Prescott Water Authority expanded its operations. Some were about land disputes or debt complications or the bureaucratic tangle of the territorial government. They helped when they could. They referred to attorneys in Tucson when they could not. And gradually, through that summer and into the fall, they built a reputation in the Copper Creek Valley as a couple whose judgment could be trusted, which was not a thing that either of them had planned, but that suited them both in a way that felt like evidence of some right alignment. The Burke brothers came back in September. They came in person this time, both of them, arriving at the ranch house on a Thursday morning with a lawyer from Flagstaff and a document that challenged the validity of the water rights filing on the grounds that the condition clause in the agreement was legally unenforceable under territorial law. Their argument was technical, and the lawyer presented it with the practiced smoothness of a man who had made this argument before in different forms against different targets. Chester listened to the whole presentation without expression. Then he thanked the lawyer for his time, excused himself for a moment, and went to find Ella, who was in the kitchen garden directing Raphael in the late-season harvest. "The Burke brothers are here," he said, "with a lawyer who wants to challenge the water rights filing." She straightened up. She had flour on her hands from the morning bread-making she had been doing before the garden. She wiped them on her apron. "What is the argument?" he told her. She listened with her eyes slightly narrowed, the way she did when she was processing information quickly. "That argument fails," she said. "The condition clause is documented as a mutually agreed modification to the original agreement, and both signatures are present. The legal threshold for an enforceable condition in a civil contract in this territory is mutual consent and consideration, both of which are clearly established." She paused. "But I would like to hear exactly what language the lawyer is using, because if there is a procedural angle I am missing, I want to know about it now rather than in a courtroom. You want to come talk to him?" "Yes. Give me a moment to wash my hands." She came around the corner of the ranch house 2 minutes later, clean-handed and still wearing her apron, which she had decided against removing on the grounds that it was her property, and she could wear what she liked on it. And she looked at Harlow Burke and Theodore Burke and their Flagstaff lawyer, and the lawyer blinked at her, and then looked at Chester with the politely bewildered expression of a man who had not expected the ranch wife to be part of this conversation. "Mrs. Sheridan," he said. "Yes," Ella said pleasantly. "I understand you have a challenge to the water rights filing. Please tell me the specific procedural basis." 20 minutes later, the Flagstaff lawyer had clearly exhausted his prepared material and was beginning to look somewhat uncomfortable. Ella had responded to every argument with a specific counter-reference to territorial law, citing section and subsection from memory, and had asked 3 questions that he could not answer cleanly. Harlow Burke, the older of the 2 brothers, was watching her with an expression that had moved from dismissive to calculating. "You have studied the law," he said, interrupting his own lawyer. "I have read everything available to me on the subject," Ella said. "Yes. You are the one who set up the condition." "The condition was a mutual agreement between myself and my husband." She met his eyes. "As I understand it, Mr. Burke, your interest in this valley predates the Water Authority regulations. Your interest is in the land, not the water. The water was a mechanism." Harlow Burke looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Chester. "You have a smart wife." "I know," Chester said. He had barely spoken in the last 20 minutes and had been watching with an expression that Ella could not read from the angle she was standing at, though she had a feeling she would be able to describe it more specifically later. "The challenge will not succeed," Ella continued, "and you know that. So I would ask you to consider what you actually want, which is presumably a return on the investment of time and money you have put into this valley. There are opportunities here that do not require anyone to lose their land. If you are genuinely interested in the territory's water infrastructure, the Prescott Authority is actively seeking private co-investment in their canal project north of Flagstaff." She paused. That is a legitimate opportunity with better long-term prospects than what you have been attempting here. A silence. Theodore Burke, who had not spoken at all, looked at his brother. Harlow Burke picked up his hat from the porch railing where he had set it. "You are suggesting we redirect." "I am suggesting you calculate accurately," Ella said. Another silence. Then Harlow Burke made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one, put on his hat and said to his lawyer, "We are done here." He looked at Chester Sheridan. He looked at Ella. "Mrs. Sheridan," and the three of them walked to their horses and rode out. Chester watched them go until they were a distant, dusty line on the southern road. Then he turned to Ella. "The canal project north of Flagstaff," he said. "It is a real thing. I read about it in the Territorial Gazette last month. Is it genuinely a good investment? Probably. Better than harassing homesteaders, certainly." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly and said, "You just redirected the Burke brothers into legitimate infrastructure investment. I suggested a better use of their resources," she said. "Whether they take the suggestion is their affair." "Ella." "Yes. I am going to say something and I need you to receive it without deflecting it with a practical observation." She was quiet, which was her version of agreement. "You are extraordinary," he said. "Not in the general sense, specifically. In the way that means I am going to be finding out new things about you for the rest of my life, and every single one of them is going to make everything better." She felt the heat come into her face, which she could not entirely prevent. "That is a very large statement." "I know. I mean it completely." She stepped forward and put her arms around him, not the careful proprietary embrace of a new marriage finding its grammar, but a full and certain one, the way you hold something you are not afraid of losing. He held her back with the same completeness. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I have been meaning to say that. I kept waiting for the right moment, and there have been a lot of right moments, and I kept thinking the next one would be better." His arms tightened around her. "I love you," he said. "I have been thinking that since approximately March of 1881, which means I have had it for 2.5 years without being able to say it." March of 1881. "You were arguing with old Mrs. Perkins at the church fundraiser about whether the new school needed a proper science curriculum. You were completely right, and you knew you were completely right, and you were still listening to her objections with perfect patience and taking notes. I remember that argument. You won it. The school got its science curriculum. And I went home that night and sat in my kitchen and thought, I am in a considerable amount of trouble," Chester said. "And I was right." She laughed against his shoulder. He laughed too, and she could feel it in his chest, that warm, full sound, and the afternoon was around them. Desert and sky and the smell of sage and the sound of the creek. And her father's land was behind her and his land was ahead, and it was all one piece now, the way it should be. The fall of 1883 brought good news. The cattle market was strong, and the combined Sheridan operation, larger now and better watered than it had been in lean years, produced a profit that allowed Chester to pay off the last of the mortgage on the original ranch acreage, and to make the first improvements to the Walker homestead buildings that had been deferred during the difficult years. The little adobe house became a proper guest house, repaired and whitewashed and furnished comfortably, because Ella was not willing to simply abandon the place where she had come into herself. She planted her father's grave with a creosote bush that would last 100 years if the rains came right. She put a flat stone beside it that said James Walker, good man, and she visited it on Sunday mornings with coffee in the old tin cup he had used every morning of his adult life, and she talked to him about what was happening, the way she had talked to him when he was alive, and it helped in the way that grief's rituals always help. Chester came with her sometimes. He did not talk, but he sat beside her, and that was its own comfort. In November, Ella confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks, and told Chester on a Friday evening, by the fireplace, that they were going to have a child. The expression on his face was one she had never seen before, and would spend the rest of her life being glad she had been present for. It moved through surprise, and then something that was too large for his face to contain easily, a kind of gratitude and joy and terror all at once. And then he was on his knees in front of her chair with his hands covering hers, and looking up at her with the completely undone expression of a man who has been surprised by happiness after a long time of not expecting it. When, he asked, June, I think, Dr. Holt will be more specific. June, he said it the way you say a word that has just become very important. A summer child. Yes. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands for a moment, then he looked up at her. Are you well? Do you feel all right? I feel quite well, she said. A little tired in the mornings, otherwise normal. You will tell me if anything changes. Chester, I am a practical person. I am not going to conceal medical information from you. No, I know. He was still looking at her with that expression. I am not being logical. Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive. She reached out and put her hand against his face. This is the thing that I wanted to tell you about. When I said I had been thinking about other things for 2 years, what this would look like. Did you imagine a June child? I did not specify. I imagined the rest of it. The rest of it, Chester said. He turned his head slightly to press his mouth against her palm. Tell me. So she did. She told him about the life she had imagined, sitting at her kitchen table in the Walker homestead on the nights she was most honest with herself, the partnership and the land and the children she had thought about abstractly, and the specific quality of presence she had imagined in the person beside her. She had not named him in those imaginings, or not exactly, but the shape of him had always been unmistakable. Chester listened to all of it. He sat on the floor of his ranch house with his back against her chair and her hand in his hair and the fire burning down beside them, and he listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. I did not let myself imagine it, he said. I decided when I came west that I was building something, and the building was enough, and wanting more than what I had was a kind of ingratitude for what I had already managed. He paused. That was a very lonely way to live. Yes, she said. It was. You noticed I was lonely. I noticed you had closed certain doors. I noticed you opened them a little when you were with me. You noticed a lot. I pay attention to things that matter to me, she said. He was quiet again. Then very quietly, I am so glad you did not give up and find someone else to be patient with. Chester, there was no one else. There was not going to be anyone else. You were the one I was paying attention to. He turned and looked at her over his shoulder. Since when? She considered honesty against dignity and chose honesty. The second week after we arrived, she said. You helped my father fix his wagon in the rain, and you did it without being asked and without making a point of it, and then you left without making conversation. That was it. I was gone. The second week, Chester said slowly. I told you I was not good at patience. You exercised it for 3 years. Because the alternative was terrifying you, which clearly remained a possibility up until I put a marriage condition in a legal document. He laughed. She laughed. Outside, the November wind moved through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was playing a harmonica, a slow wandering melody that had nothing particular to say, just sound in the darkness, and the fire crackled, and the ranch house was warm and full of them, and their life in it. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was the kind of winter that tested everything and brought people closer. A hard freeze in January took several of the older cattle and required around-the-clock management of the herd to prevent greater losses. Chester was out in it for 3 days running, coming in briefly to eat and sleep and then back out, and Ella managed the household and the supply lines, and the communication with neighboring ranchers with a competence that no one who had known her for any length of time was surprised by, but that Chester's men talked about among themselves with a respect that moved beyond polite to genuine. Samuel Beaumont, the foreman, came to Ella one evening while Chester was out checking on the far herd and said without preamble, "He is working too hard." "I know," Ella said. "He will not slow down while the cattle are at risk." "You are the only one he listens to," Samuel said. This was a statement of fact offered without judgment by a man who had watched Chester Sheridan for 4 years and understood exactly what it meant. Ella went out the next evening and made him come in. She did not ask. she said, in the tone she used when she had already decided, "You are coming inside. Samuel will take the next watch. The herd is stable, and you are not going to be useful to anyone if you collapse in a freeze." And Chester, who argued with almost everyone about almost everything as a matter of operational principle, came inside without a word. Samuel Beaumont told this story to anyone who would listen for the next 10 years. The freeze broke in February and the spring came early, and Ella's pregnancy progressed in a way that Dr. Holt described as straightforwardly healthy, which was the best possible news. She kept working. Chester tried in the early months to suggest that she reduce her activity, and she received these suggestions with the particular patient expression she had developed specifically for when Chester was being protective beyond reason, and he learned fairly quickly to confine his protective impulses to the practical and leave the rest of it to her judgment. They spent the long winter evenings in ways that revealed them to each other. Ella taught Chester the principles of land law that she had taught herself, and he absorbed them quickly and with genuine interest, asking questions that were more sophisticated than she expected. Chester taught Ella the specific mathematics of cattle breeding and seasonal market timing, which she had understood in outline but not in the fine-grained detail that made the difference between a good year and a great one. They read to each other. She found the poetry on his shelf and asked about it, and he told her about his mother, who had read poetry in the evenings, and they read those volumes together by the fire. And she did not tease him about being a rancher who read poetry, because she found it entirely consistent with who he was. She told him about her own mother, who had died when Ella was 14, and who had been a very different kind of person from Ella herself, warm and social, and not particularly interested in law or practicality, but who had loved her daughter with a fierce and uncomplicated devotion that Ella had carried all the way from Missouri like a stone in her pocket. He listened to everything. He never tried to solve the things that did not need solving. He was, she found, as good a listener as she had hoped for and better than she had expected. June came. The birth was hard in the way that first births often were in 1884, long and exhausting and attended by Dr. Holt, and a midwife named Mrs. Cordelia Vasquez, who had delivered 300 babies in the territory and had the calm authority of deep experience. Chester was in the house. He had been told to wait in the parlor, and he did wait in the parlor for approximately 45 minutes before he began a very controlled, very quiet form of pacing that Mrs. Vasquez, when she came out briefly for supplies, said was the most restrained pacing she had ever observed and was actually charming. At 4 in the morning on a Wednesday in June, their son was born. Chester heard him before he was permitted into the room, a small furious sound that was simultaneously the most alarming thing he had ever heard and the best. Ella was sitting up against the pillows with the infant against her chest, and she was pale and tired and more completely herself than she had ever looked in his experience of her, which was saying something significant. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was very small and very red and was making the expression of a person who had not yet decided whether this new situation was acceptable. He had dark hair like his mother. "Hello," Chester said to him, which was all he could manage. "He is healthy," Ella said. "Dr. Holt says he is very healthy." "And you?" Chester looked up at her. "Ella, are you all right?" "I am tired," she said. "I am the most tired I have ever been in my life, but I am perfectly well." She looked down at the infant. "We need to name him." They had discussed names through the winter. They had a list organized by Ella with the thoroughness she brought to everything, with Chester's preferences noted and hers and the areas of agreement marked. They had come to an agreement in March and Chester had thought it was settled, but he looked at Ella now looking at their son and waited. "James," she said. He had expected it and it still moved something in him. "James Chester Sheridan," he said. "Yes." She looked up at him. "You are sure?" "Your father would have made an extraordinary grandfather," Chester said. "He deserves to be in this child's name." She pressed her lips together briefly. "He would have been insufferable about it," she said. he would have been here every day. I know, I was looking forward to it. They were both quiet for a moment, with the baby between them and the pre-dawn dark outside and the whole long future of this life they had made. Chester, Ella said, yes, I want to tell you something. I need you to receive it without deflecting it with a practical observation. He recognized his own words back to him and smiled. Tell me. I am so glad I put that condition in the document, she said. I am so glad I was brave enough to do it. Because if I had not, I might have waited another year or 2 or 5, and this would have started later, and I would have had less of it. And I want all of it. I want all of the time we are going to have. Chester reached out and put his hand against her face, the gesture that was his, the careful, tender one that she had been leaning into for a year now. You are going to have all of it, he said. I promise you that. You cannot promise that, she said practically. No, but I can mean it with everything I have, and I do. She leaned into his hand. James Chester Sheridan, named for a grandfather he would never meet, and a father who was already determined to be everything that name deserved, made a small sound between them that was probably not agreement, but that Ella decided to take as such. The years that followed were full years. Not easy years, because nothing in the Arizona Territory in the 1880s was easy, and life has its texture and its difficulty regardless of how well you plan. But full. The Sheridan Ranch continued to grow. The combined property, with its solid water rights and Ella's irrigation improvements extended across both original properties, became one of the more productive operations in the valley. Chester expanded the cattle operation carefully, the way he did everything, step by step with a clear eye on the balance. And by 1887, they employed 19 men and had a relationship with the territorial cattle market that gave them pricing stability that smaller operations could not achieve. Ella formalized what had been happening informally. She had been the person her neighbors came to with legal and regulatory questions for 3 years, and in 1886, she wrote a letter to an attorney in Tucson named Malcolm Pierce, who had a reputation for taking on cases the bigger firms would not touch. She laid out her self-taught knowledge, the cases she had helped neighbors navigate, the water rights work she had done, and asked directly whether there was a formal arrangement that would allow her to assist his practice as a paralegal correspondent for the valley's smaller homesteaders. Malcolm Pierce wrote back within a week. He was, he said, genuinely impressed. He offered an arrangement by which Ella would serve as his correspondence contact in the Copper Creek Valley, handling the initial review and documentation of land and water cases, with Pierce handling the formal legal representation. He would pay her a retainer that was modest but real. She showed the letter to Chester. He read it twice and then said, "This is exactly what you should be doing. You are not concerned about the time it will take. You have been doing it for free," he said. "Now you will be paid. That is strictly an improvement. You are not going to tell me that a rancher's wife should not be corresponding with a Tucson attorney about legal matters." Chester looked at her with the expression he had when she asked him questions he thought she already knew the answer to. "Ella, I fell in love with you while you were arguing about science education. I have never had any interest in you being anything other than exactly who you are." He paused. "Also, you are better at the law than most of the lawyers I have dealt with, and this valley needs someone who can help people navigate the water authority without getting taken advantage of. If you do not do it, nobody will." She worked with Malcolm Pierce for years. She became, in the unofficial geography of the Copper Creek Valley, the person people came to when the system was moving against them, particularly the smaller homesteaders and the Mexican-American families who were consistently underserved by the formal legal structures of the territory. She could not be their attorney. She was not licensed and could not be in 1886. But she could be the person who understood the documents, who knew the regulations, who could tell you what your deed actually said, and what the law actually required, and what arguments might be made in your favor. She and Chester talked about this work the way they talked about everything, directly and at length, and without conclusion, in the sense that they always left room for the next conversation. Chester had come west with the particular blindness of his era, the assumption that the West was a blank space waiting to be organized by men like him. The years with Ella had complicated that picture significantly, and he was honest enough to let it be complicated. He saw what the water authority regulations were doing to families who could not document their historical water access, because they had been using the land for generations before documentation was required. He saw what the land title system did to homesteaders who could not navigate its bureaucracy. He did not try to fix all of it, but he also did not pretend it was not happening, and he used his position in the valley to make what small differences a man with influence could make. They argued about this sometimes. Ella thought he could do more. Chester thought she was right but was less certain about the methods. These arguments were never resolved in the sense of someone winning, but they always ended in the same place, which was two people committed to the same general direction even when they disagreed about the specific routes. Their family grew. James had 3 years alone before his brother arrived, and William Walker Sheridan came into the world in the spring of 1887, with considerably less drama than James had, and with his father's gray eyes and his mother's particular expression of assessment, which she noticed at about 6 weeks and which made her laugh every time she saw it. When William was 2, their daughter arrived. They named her Clara after Chester's mother, and she arrived in the world with an opinion about it that she began expressing immediately and did not stop expressing at any point in the next several decades. James adored her. William was philosophical about her. Chester looked at her with an expression of complete helplessness from the very first day, and Ella found this enormously satisfying. The house was different with 3 children. It was fuller and louder and more complicated, and it was, to both of them, so thoroughly the right shape of their life that it was impossible to imagine the alternative. Chester, who had been raising himself since he was 17, and had no particular model for fatherhood beyond what he had absorbed of his own father's shortcomings, turned out to be an extraordinary one. He was present. He was patient in a way that surprised people who knew him primarily as the controlled, contained man he was in professional settings. He taught James to ride at 4, the way his own father had taught him, and he taught William at the same age. And when Clara announced at 3 that she also wished to learn, he put her in the saddle in front of him and rode with her across the home pasture while she held the pommel and issued commentary on the scenery. Ella watched this from the fence and felt something that was past happiness, the quieter, deeper thing. The summer of 1889 brought a piece of news from Flagstaff that reached them by telegram at the Copper Creek General Store. Theodore Burke had invested in the Prescott Water Authority's canal project. The project had turned a significant profit in its 2nd year. The Burke brothers, by the account of the Flagstaff newspaper that someone had thought to send along with the telegram, were redirecting their investment strategy toward territorial infrastructure with what the newspaper described as surprising success. Ella read this at the kitchen table and folded the telegram carefully. Chester came in from the yard and she handed it to him. He read it. "You were right about the canal project," he said. "I thought it was a reasonable suggestion. You redirected predatory land investors into profitable infrastructure development. They made the choice," she said. "I just gave them a better option to look at." He set the telegram down. "I am going to say something." "Say it." "That morning in your office, when I walked in with that document and that particular morning's degree of self-righteousness." He paused. "I was wrong to handle it that way. I should have come to you weeks earlier when the Water Authority letter arrived and talked about it together." She looked at him. It had been 6 years. "Chester, I know, it was a long time ago, but I have thought about it many times and I want to say it properly." "What you just said is proper enough," she said. "And for what it is worth, I am glad you handled it the way you did, Because if you had come to me weeks earlier and talked about it together, I would not have had my back against the wall, and if I had not had my back against the wall, I would not have had the nerve to write that condition. He considered this. You might have found another way. Possibly, but that way worked. It worked exceptionally well, he said, given everything that came from it. He came around the table and put his hands on her shoulders and bent to press his mouth to the top of her head, which was a particular gesture of his, affectionate and domestic and entirely unconscious. The kind of thing people do when they have been physically comfortable with someone for long enough that the body moves toward them without asking permission. She put her hand over his. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see James chasing William across the yard with something that appeared to be a captured lizard, and Clara sitting in the large chair on the porch with one of Chester's old hats on her head and an expression of complete authority as though she were running something. "We have done well," Ella said. "We have," Chester agreed. "You did most of it." "We did all of it together," she said firmly. "That is the point." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "All of it together," he said. "Yes." The decade turned. The 1890s came in with a drought that tested everyone in the territory. 2 hard years of reduced rainfall that made the water rights they had secured look like genuine foresight. Several families in the valley nearly lost their homesteads, and the Sheridans helped where they could, extending credit, sharing water access from the supplemental reservoir that Chester had built in 1887, partly on Ella's suggestion, connecting families with Malcolm Pierce's legal practice when the water authorities' regulations threatened to be weaponized against them. The drought broke in 1892, with rains so generous that Cottonwood Creek ran higher than anyone had seen it in 20 years, and the valley turned green in a way that made people who had lived through the dry years stand outside in it with their faces turned up and their eyes closed. James Sheridan was 9 that year, brown and sturdy and relentlessly curious, with his mother's directness and his father's stillness, a combination that his teachers found simultaneously challenging and impressive. William was 6 and thoroughly occupied with horses, an interest that had declared itself early and showed no signs of diversifying. Clara was 4 and in the complete command of every room she entered, a quality that her parents found alarming and endearing in equal measure. Ella turned 34 in the summer of 1892. Chester turned 40. He did not make a particular event of his birthday, which was consistent with his character, but she made a particular event of it, inviting the neighbors and their children and Samuel Beaumont and his wife Martha, who had come from Tucson 3 years earlier, and had immediately and completely reorganized the ranch household operations in ways that everyone found improvements, and Rafael Gutierrez and his family, who had been part of the valley's fabric for years. They ate outside under the cottonwoods, which had grown enormous, and the children ran between the tables and the stars came out above the desert, while the adults talked and laughed with the ease of people who have been through things together. Chester stood at the edge of the gathering at one point and watched it all, and Ella came to stand beside him, and they were quiet together the way they had been on his porch on the evening. She told him he was extraordinary, the companionable quiet of 2 people who are at home. 10 years, Chester said. 7, she said. We met in 1880. I meant married. 9 almost. 9 years, he looked over at her. You have been my wife for 9 years. Do you require a recounting of events? No, I am just finding it remarkable. He looked back at the gathering, at the table of food and the children chasing fireflies at the edge of the light and the neighbors who were their community, the web of connection that had grown from 2 people and a piece of land. I could not have imagined this. When I came west, I could not have imagined any of this. The ranch, she asked. You, he said simply. The children, this. He gestured at the whole of it. I was building something the way I told you. I knew how to build things. I did not know how to make them into a life. You knew, she said. You just needed a push. He looked at her sideways. You always come back to the condition. It worked, she said, which was her permanent position on the subject. It worked, he agreed. She leaned against him just slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that and watched the fireflies and the children and the neighbors under the enormous Arizona sky, and the cottonwoods made their dry summer sound in the warm night air, and Cottonwood Creek ran cold and clear and steady through the dark beyond the trees. The years after that were the deepening kind. Not the dramatic years of water rights agreements and forced conditions and Burke brothers appearing at the door, not the urgent first years of figuring out what they were to each other and whether they could make it work. These were the years of already knowing, of the thing being established and rooted and tested by ordinary time. Chester's hair went silver at the temples. Ella's laugh lines deepened, and she found she liked them. James went east to study at 17, a decision that involved lengthy discussions around the kitchen table, and came back 3 years later with a law degree that he had pursued partly because of his mother's library, and partly because of what he had seen her do with her legal knowledge throughout his childhood. He set up a practice in Copper Creek that was the first formal legal office the town had ever had, and within 2 years, he was handling the kind of work his mother had been doing informally for 15 years, and he cited her precedents with complete regularity. William stayed with the land. He had known since he was 6 that cattle and horses were his life, and he was right, and the Sheridan Ranch in the 20th century would bear his mark. He married a woman named Grace Torres in 1905, a school teacher from Tucson with a very direct way of speaking that Chester said reminded him of someone, which Ella found deeply satisfying. Clara became a school teacher herself, in Copper Creek first and then in Tucson, and she taught science among other subjects and was known for being the most demanding and most beloved teacher in every school she taught in, a combination that she had apparently inherited from both parents in different proportions. Chester and Ella grew old in the valley together, in the house they had built out of the ranch house and the Walker homestead combined, a proper house now with real windows and a good wood floor and bookshelves along most of the parlor wall, and the kitchen garden that Ella had been tending for 30 years. They kept working. Neither of them was constitutionally suited to stopping, and they had the sense to understand this about themselves. They argued sometimes, as they always had, about practical matters, and occasionally about matters that were less practical, and they resolved those arguments the way they always had, through the sturdy mechanism of mutual respect and the bedrock knowledge of who each other was. Chester learned, over the years, to say the things he felt with more regularity and less management, a development Ella credited partly to her persistent example and partly to the children, who had never been interested in his management of his face. Ella learned over the years to allow the practical efficiency to rest sometimes, to sit with a feeling before she organized it into action, a development she credited partly to Chester's steadiness and partly to the particular piece of a life that had turned out to be the one she had wanted. The Copper Creek Valley changed around them. The railroad came through in 1895. The territorial government became a state government in 1912, when Arizona was admitted to the Union, and Ella voted in that year's election, one of the first women in the state to do so, wearing her best hat and arriving at the polling place with the particular expression she used when she was doing something that mattered. Orville Gibbs at the land office, very old by 1912, recognized her when she came in and said, "Mrs. Sheridan, of course. I remember you filed a water rights challenge once that you withdrew inside a week. I resolved the matter privately," she said. "So I recall," Orville Gibbs said, with a smile that suggested he recalled it rather more specifically than that. Dr. Holt was long retired by then, replaced by a succession of younger physicians who each seemed to Ella slightly too young, until they stopped seeming young at all. Samuel Beaumont had retired to a house in Copper Creek with Martha, and could be found most mornings on his porch with coffee. Rafael Gutierrez still worked his own land to the south, and appeared at the Sheridan Ranch for every significant occasion with his extended family in train and a guitar. Chester's 61st birthday was the summer of 1913, which was also the 30th anniversary of the year they had married, and Ella organized a gathering that drew people from across the territory, families whose legal situations she had helped navigate, neighbors whose water access she had fought to protect, men who had worked for the Sheridan Ranch in various configurations over 3 decades. It was a larger gathering than the one for his 40th, and louder, and there were grandchildren now, 3 of them from James and his wife, 2 from William and Grace, all of them between 2 and 8 years old and thoroughly unmoved by the historical significance of the occasion. Chester stood at the edge of this gathering too, the way he had 30 years ago, and she stood beside him, and the cottonwoods were enormous now, and the creek ran below them in the evening light, and the sky was the particular blue of a June evening in the desert. "You are going to say 30 years," she said. "30 years," he confirmed. "And you are going to say you could not have imagined it." "I could not have imagined it. And I am going to say that it started with a very sensible condition in a water rights agreement. The most sensible thing anyone has ever added to a legal document," Chester said. "I thought so." He looked at her. 30 years of looking at her face, and it still did what it had always done. That particular thing that he had been calling a condition of his existence for so long he no longer tried to describe it more specifically. She was 55 years old, and she was completely herself, direct-eyed and steady and smiling at him with the smile she saved for him, the one without the professional composure, the one that was just Ella. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." "Thank you," Chester said, "for being brave enough to do what you did, for knowing what we needed when I did not have the courage to reach for it myself, for every year since." He paused. "For this." She looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were bright, and she did not blink the brightness away this time because there was no one left to be composed for. "You are welcome," she said, "and thank you for walking through the door when I opened it. I nearly didn't. I know, that is why it means something that you did." He took her hand, the way he always did with both of his, that particular gesture that was his alone, and they stood there in the long June evening, with the grandchildren running between the tables and the cottonwoods and the creek and the valley all around them. The land they had built together out of a water rights agreement and a condition, and the particular courage of 2 people who had been circling each other long enough and had finally, between them, found the way in. And the cottonwoods made their dry, bright sound in the summer wind, and Cottonwood Creek ran cold and certain through the land that was theirs, and the Arizona sky went from gold to rose to the deep velvet of a June night, and Chester Sheridan held his wife's hand, and Ella Walker Sheridan held his, and every door they had ever needed to open was open, and every door they had ever needed to close was closed, and they were exactly where they had both been, in their most honest selves, trying to get to all along.